Arrogant judge humiliates black lawyer in court. But he turns the tables brilliantly. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where real stories cut through the darkness and truth always finds its way. Today's story. It begins in a courtroom ruled by fear. A judge feared not for her fairness, but for her ego. For 24 years, she silenced voices and buried justice. But then, he walked in. A black lawyer she tried to humiliate. What she didn't know was that he didn't come to play by her rules, he came to end them. Before we dive into this gripping courtroom twist, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to light. Now, take a deep breath, because what happens next no one in that courtroom saw coming. The Jefferson County Courthouse didn't just hold trials, it held its breath. The air inside wasn't thick from the Alabama humidity, but from the weight of something far older and far more suffocating: fear. It clung to the walls like mold, tucked itself into the marble floors and the high ceilings, whispered its warnings through the creak of every wooden bench. And at the center of it all sat Judge Evelyn Whitmore, unmoved and unmovable, like a statue carved from cold stone and raw ego. She never needed to raise her voice. Her silence was louder than most men's fury. Behind her thin-rimmed glasses, her eyes scanned the courtroom like a hawk watching prey, too dumb to know they were already bleeding. She had reigned from that bench for over 20 years, long enough to mold the space around her image, long enough to make the law bend without ever seeming to touch it. Attorneys knew better than to test her. They whispered her name like a warning in back hallways and elevators. Especially the young, especially the black, because they didn't just fear losing a case under her rule, they feared losing their voice, their dignity, and sometimes their careers. Her courtroom wasn't about truth, it was theater, and Evelyn Whitmore was the director, the lead, the one who decided who would speak and who would be silenced. In this space, justice didn't walk blindfolded, it walked bent-backed and bruised, obeying a script written long before anyone stepped through those oak doors. And yet, on this particular morning, something was different. You could feel it not in anything said, but in the spaces between the sounds. A shift, a stillness that felt too intentional. The guards stood a little straighter. The clerks typed a little slower, as if even they sensed that the performance today would not go as planned. That someone in the cast had rewritten the ending. But Whitmore, with her perfectly composed face and her ever-sharpened tongue, didn't flinch. She had faced 1,000 challenges before and buried each one beneath layers of legal jargon and icy condescension. To her, this was just another day, another defendant, another black man who would leave this place wearing chains. The only unknown was that today, someone else had brought a mirror into her courtroom. And she had no idea she was about to see herself. He walked in like a man who knew the weight of every step he took. Marcus Grant wasn't new to courtrooms, and he sure as hell wasn't new to the cold, quiet wrath of Judge Evelyn Whitmore. At 48, he carried himself with the calm of someone who had already survived every kind of war, racial, legal, personal, and still walked tall. His suit was pressed, shoes shined to a mirror finish, and his briefcase clutched in his left hand looked like any other. But it wasn't. Inside wasn't just paperwork. It was a strategy carefully crafted, patiently fed, and sharpened over the years like a blade waiting for its moment. Marcus had built a career on the cases no one else wanted. The hopeless ones, the dangerous ones, the ones that risked not just losing but being erased. And yet, he never blinked. That's why his name carried weight far beyond the Alabama borders. He wasn't flashy, didn't posture, he didn't need to. His presence was enough. When he stepped into Whitmore's courtroom that morning, the marble floor under his shoes didn't just echo, it announced. Even before she looked up, she knew it was him. The tension in her jaw, the stiffening of her shoulders, it all betrayed what her cold expression tried to hide. She hated that it was him. Not for what he had done, not for who he was defending, but simply for who he was. Black, brilliant, and unbending. Marcus didn't look at her as he passed. He didn't need to. He had already read this room 100 times over in his mind. had mapped every way it could turn against him. But today wasn't about fear. Today was about clarity. His client, Darius Moore, sat at the defense table young, broken, wrists cuffed too tight and hope fading fast. Another black man accused of a crime with flimsy evidence and a system too eager to swallow him whole. But Marcus had seen the file, seen the cracks, the lies dressed up as law. And more than that, he had seen Whitmore's fingerprints all over it. Not directly, no, she was too polished for that. But the stench of her influence was unmistakable. This wasn't just a case to Marcus. This was an opportunity, a reckoning. And he wasn't going to raise his voice or slam his fist on a table to get it. He was going to do what he did best: cut with precision, expose with facts, and corner his opponent until there was nowhere left to run. Marcus took his seat beside Darius, his face unreadable, calm like still water before a storm. He leaned in close, his voice low, but firm. "Today," he said, "we don't just defend you, we change everything." Darius looked at him, unsure whether to believe, still half buried under years of mistrust. But Marcus didn't need him to believe just yet. He just needed him to hold on. Because the script Judge Whitmore thought she was directing, Marcus was already rewriting it. And the curtain was about to rise. The trial had barely begun. But it was already clear who controlled the rhythm of the room. Judge Evelyn Whitmore didn't need to shout commands. Her tone alone sliced through the air like a blade dipped in ice. Every time Marcus opened his mouth to raise an objection, she shut him down without a blink. "Overruled," she said, before the last syllable even left his lips. "Move on, counselor," she snapped, as if his presence was a personal offense. And while she clipped his wings at every turn, the young prosecutor Cole Barrett soared, guided by her gentle nudges like a favored pupil in a rigged classroom. Cole was fresh out of law school, sharp-suited and overly confident, the kind of man who mistook proximity to power for actual power. He stumbled through legal arguments like a rookie, and each time he faltered, Whitmore subtly stepped in, rephrasing his words for him, filling in his blanks, even correcting his tone with the kind of patience she reserved only for people who mirrored her reflection. The bias was so thick it clung to the walls, staining every word spoken. The jury noticed, the court reporter noticed, even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably behind his post. But no one said a word, because this wasn't just Whitmore's courtroom, it was her kingdom. She didn't need to intimidate. She simply made everyone afraid to breathe wrong. And yet, there was one man who refused to dance to her rhythm. Marcus sat still, his face unreadable, his movements precise. Every question he asked was calculated, not just for the witness but for the room. He wasn't just defending his client. He was collecting moments. Every time she interrupted him, every time she shot down a valid legal point, every time she treated him like a nuisance rather than an officer of the court. He was stacking them, methodically, piece by piece, like building a case inside the case. Because Marcus knew that exposing bias wasn't about loud declarations. It was about silence, the kind that made people listen harder, look closer, question what they were told to believe. He wasn't fighting her head on. He was leading her, slowly but surely, into revealing herself. And she didn't even see it. Whitmore, drunk on her own control, didn't realize that the more she tried to dismiss him, the more power she handed him. Cole Barrett, too green to read the room, kept flashing smug grins toward the jury, unaware that his performance was unraveling. And the jury, once passive, was beginning to shift, not just in their seats, but in their awareness. The game was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about truth, and truth, when denied for too long, has a way of roaring back with a vengeance. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was a protest. His calm was defiance. And Whitmore, in her arrogance, was giving him everything he needed to break her from the inside out. The moment Marcus stood and calmly pointed out the prosecution's failure to disclose exculpatory evidence, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted like the air before a storm. His voice was steady, not raised, but it carried the weight of something undeniable. "Your Honor, this is a clear Brady violation," he said, lifting a document gently from his file, holding it up like a mirror to everything rotten beneath the surface. Judge Whitmore didn't even flinch. She leaned back slightly, tapped her gavel once sharp, final, and dismissed the claim with a tone soaked in boredom. "Denied," she said, without so much as looking at the paper. But the damage was done. And not to Marcus. The jurors exchanged glances, some fidgeting in their seats, others narrowing their eyes at the judge who had just refused to acknowledge a foundational principle of justice. The gallery stirred, a low murmur sweeping through the benches. Marcus didn't move. He didn't press further. He simply let the silence hang. Let the room marinate in the wrongness of it all. Whitmore sat higher in her seat, relishing the moment, convinced she had won yet another battle with effortless disdain. She couldn't see what Marcus already knew, that control is most dangerous when it's slipping. Then it happened. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, slamming against the walls with a force that made every head turn. 2 federal agents entered in dark suits, their steps measured, eyes fixed. The room froze. For a second, it was as if time bowed to what was about to unfold. Even Whitmore faltered, her brow tightening in a twitch she couldn't hide fast enough. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, voice thin with irritation that barely covered a flicker of fear. One of the agents raised a badge, his voice crisp. "Judge Evelyn Whitmore, we need to speak with you immediately." Her gavel came down again, desperate this time. "This is highly inappropriate. I'm in the middle of a trial." But the other agent stepped forward, eyes sweeping across the stunned faces. "This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait." Murmurs turned into audible gasps. Even Cole Barrett, the smug young prosecutor, looked like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Should we take a recess, Your Honor?" he mumbled, voice suddenly unsure. "No," Whitmore snapped. "We will not be." The first agent cut her off with a single sentence that detonated across the room like thunder. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Everything stopped. No breath, no movement, just the crackling sound of reality breaking. The judge who had ruled from on high, who had twisted the law to suit her pride, was now the one standing trial, not in theory, not in symbolism, but in handcuffs. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and looked her in the eye, not with anger, but with finality. "You just denied my motion for a mistrial," he said quietly, "but it seems this trial is no longer your concern." Her face lost color. Her mouth opened, then closed. One of the agents stepped forward and began reading the charges aloud: abuse of power, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations. Every word was a hammer, breaking down the facade she had built over decades. And as they turned her around and clicked the cuffs into place, the courtroom wasn't just watching a woman fall, they were watching an empire of fear collapse under its own weight. Justice had finally entered the room, not through the front door, but through a reckoning. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was absolute, the kind that comes only after something sacred shatters. Judge Evelyn Whitmore, the woman who once ruled this room like a monarch cloaked in robes of law, now stood cuffed, hands behind her back, her face stripped of command. Her eyes darted first to the jury, then to the gallery, then to Marcus, as if searching for something she could still control. But there was nothing left. The weight of her name, the cold grip of her gavel, the sharpness of her tongue, all of it dissolved under the sound of federal charges being read aloud for all to hear. For the first time in 24 years, she wasn't the one defining the law. She was the one standing under it. And Marcus, he didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, the kind of calm that comes only from years of holding your breath in places that were never meant for you. He looked at her not with vengeance, but with something deeper, something quieter, something that cut cleaner than rage ever could. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I've always believed in the law," he said, steady and sure, "even when the law forgot people like me." The words hung in the air like smoke, seeping into the cracks she had ruled from for so long. She tried to hold his gaze, but her eyes broke first. Not from shame, from recognition. In that moment, she didn't just see a black lawyer standing in defiance, she saw the reckoning she never thought would come. The walls that had protected her, insulated her, elevated her, they had turned cold. They weren't hers anymore. They never were. And as the agents led her toward the back, each step she took was a descent. Not just from the bench, but from the illusion of untouchability. The courtroom watched, unmoving, some with mouths still open, some with tears they didn't understand. It wasn't just her fall they witnessed, it was the collapse of something bigger. A belief that power was permanent, that injustice could go unchecked. And through it all, Marcus stood still, unblinking, not just as a man who had won a case, but as someone who had survived the system long enough to finally make it listen. The chains came off with a quiet click, but the sound echoed like thunder. Darius Moore sat still for a moment, wrists freshly freed, fingers rubbing at the raw indentations the cuffs had left behind. Around him, the air shifted, not in celebration, but in something heavier. The judge, now a new face on the bench, nodded solemnly as he dismissed all charges, his voice carrying both justice and regret. But Darius didn't smile. He didn't stand up in triumph. His eyes, wide and stunned, scanned the room not for validation, but for something he couldn't name. There was no joy in his face, only a haunted kind of stillness, the look of a man who had come close to losing everything for nothing he did. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture that said what no words could reach. "You're free." But Darius knew freedom this late doesn't come without scars. And it doesn't erase the truth that he was never supposed to be there in the first place. The gallery was silent, jurors sitting stiff in their chairs, as if afraid to breathe too loud. Reporters stared blankly, unsure how to describe what had just happened. And those who had come only to watch now found themselves part of something they hadn't expected to witness, a system cracking. Just enough for light to leak through. But it wasn't a clean break. It was jagged, incomplete, because while Darius walked out that day with his name cleared, he carried with him the weight of every man who wouldn't, of every case that didn't have a Marcus, of every courtroom still ruled by judges like Whitmore who hadn't been caught. The people in that room exhaled, but no one felt lighter. They had seen justice, yes, but only after injustice had done its damage. Marcus watched Darius rise slowly, almost as if he wasn't sure it was real, as if the floor might still collapse beneath him. And as they walked out together, the world outside felt too bright, too big, too indifferent, because freedom, when delayed, doesn't come with parades. It comes with silence, with memory, with the quiet knowledge that somewhere out there, it's still happening. And though one man was free, the fight was far from over. Marcus gathered his files with the same calm he had carried from the moment he walked in. No fanfare, no applause, just the quiet sound of paper sliding back into a briefcase that had seen more battles than most would ever understand. He paused for a moment, looking around the courtroom that once felt like enemy territory, now cracked open just slightly to let truth breathe. His steps were slow as he walked toward the doors, not heavy, but grounded, because this wasn't closure. It wasn't victory in the way people like to package it. It was a shift, a warning, a statement carved into the cold marble of the system. Not everyone is afraid of power. Marcus knew this wasn't the last. There were more Whitmores out there wearing robes, carrying gavels, cloaked in respectability while choking the very justice they were sworn to uphold. But now, one had fallen, and that was enough for today. Enough to keep going, enough to believe that silence could be broken, that fear could be outlasted. Justice doesn't move fast, it doesn't shout, but when it moves through people who refuse to bow, it becomes unstoppable. Marcus didn't look back, he didn't have to. The echoes behind him would keep speaking long after he was gone. But now we want to hear from you. Do you believe the system can truly change, or does it only shift when someone forces it to? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if you believe in truth, justice, and stories that hold power accountable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more light into the cracks. Marcus gathered his files with the same calm he had carried from the moment he walked in. No fanfare, no applause, just the quiet sound of paper sliding back into a briefcase that had seen more battles than most would ever understand. He paused for a moment, looking around the courtroom that once felt like enemy territory, now cracked open just slightly to let truth breathe. His steps were slow as he walked toward the doors, not heavy, but grounded, because this wasn't closure. It wasn't victory in the way people like to package it. It was a shift, a warning, a statement carved into the cold marble of the system. Not everyone is afraid of power. Marcus knew this wasn't the last. There were more Whitmores out there wearing robes, carrying gavels, cloaked in respectability while choking the very justice they were sworn to uphold. But now, one had fallen, and that was enough for today. Enough to keep going. Enough to believe that silence could be broken. That fear could be outlasted. Justice doesn't move fast. It doesn't shout. But when it moves through people who refuse to bow, it becomes unstoppable. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't have to. The echoes behind him would keep speaking long after he was gone. But now we want to hear from you. Do you believe the system can truly change, or does it only shift when someone forces it to? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. And if you believe in truth, justice, and stories that hold power accountable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more light into the cracks.